The rain had stopped 3 hours before dawn, but the mud along the county road south of Mineral Wells still grabbed at truck tires like it had something to prove. Earl Garrison sat in his '68 Ford, windows down, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, staring at the fence line that used to mark where his father's land began. Used to. That was the part that made his jaw tight. He'd been awake since 2:30, couldn't sleep, kept seeing his old man's face the day they divided everything up. That was 11 years ago now, 1967, right after the funeral. 3 brothers, 1 farm, and a will that said to split it fair. Fair. Earl lit a cigarette and watched the sun come up over what used to be the east pasture. He wondered if either of his brothers was awake right now. Wondered if they ever thought about that morning they'd stood in the barn with the county assessor, dividing up 40 years of a man's life like they were dealing cards. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. When a father leaves a farm to multiple sons, what's the right way to handle it? Split the land, split the money, or leave it whole and make them work it out? Drop your answer in the comments, because this story is going to show you what happens when brothers think they know better than the old ways. The Garrison farm had been 280 acres of bottomland and rolling pasture just outside Carthage, Missouri. Good soil, good water, positioned right where Flat Creek bent south toward the Spring River. Frank Garrison had bought it in 1927 with money saved from railroad work and a loan from a man in Joplin who believed in handshakes. 40 years he'd worked that ground, raised 3 boys, buried a wife, and kept every piece of equipment running past the point where other men would have junked it. His pride was a 1949 John Deere Model A 1956 Farmel M, a hay baler he'd rebuilt twice, a grain auger he'd welded back together so many times it looked like modern art, and a disc harrow that had turned that soil since before any of his sons were born. When Frank died in the summer of '67, he left the land to all 3 boys equally, but the equipment. He'd written something strange in a will. The gear stays with the land, or it stays together. Split one, you split it all, but don't split what's meant to work as one. Nobody knew exactly what the hell that meant. Earl was the youngest, 29 that year, married to a girl from Lamar, had a baby daughter and another on the way. Tom was the middle brother, 33, ambitious, always reading farm journals and talking about modernization and efficiency ratios. And then there was Clayton, the oldest at 37, who'd never married, lived in the old farmhouse, and thought he was owed the whole place just because he'd stayed close. The morning after the funeral, they met in the barn with an assessor named Delbert Kincaid, a thin man with wire glasses who divided up more farms than he cared to count. He had plat maps, tax records, and a legal pad. What he didn't have was patience for sentiment. Simplest thing, Delbert said, spreading the maps on the workbench, is 3 equal parcels. North section goes one way, south section another, middle section to the third. You draw straws for position, sell the equipment, split the cash 3 ways. Everybody starts clean. Clayton shook his head before Delbert even finished. Dad wanted the land kept whole. That's why he said what he said. Tom laughed, not mean but not kind either. Dad said a lot of things, Clay. He also said that tractor out there would run forever, and it burns oil like a sieve. We can't all 3 farm the same ground. Doesn't work. Earl stood by the door, saying nothing, watching dust float in the light from a window. He'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks, ever since his father had gone cold in the upstairs bedroom. He knew what would happen. He'd known since he was 16. They argued for 4 hours. Clayton wanted the whole farm. Said he'd buy out his brothers over time, pay them from crop profits. Tom wanted to sell everything, split the cash, invest in something modern, maybe going on a cattle operation with a guy he knew up in Nevada. Earl, when they finally asked him, said he'd take the south parcel, the 80 acres that bordered creek, and he'd take whatever equipment they didn't want. Tom laughed at that, too. You want the junk? The old A that needs a rebuild, the baler that jams every 3rd window, the disc that's rusted to hell. Earl nodded. I'll take it. Clayton looked at him like he'd gone soft. You can't run a farm on 80 acres and broken equipment, Earl. You'll be bust in 2 seasons. Earl lit a cigarette. Same brand he still smoked 11 years later. Maybe, but I won't owe either of you a damn thing. Let me ask you this. If you were in Earl's boots that day, Would you have taken scraps in the old iron? Or would you have fought for a better deal? Tell me in the comments what you think about a man who chooses the hard road when there's an easier one sitting right there. By October of 1967, the Garrison farm was 3 separate operations. Clayton kept the north 120 acres, the farmhouse, the big barn, and he bought himself a brand new International Harvester 656. Painted red and shining, financed through the bank in Carthage with a loan that made Earl's stomach hurt just hearing the number. Tom took the middle 80, sold it 6 months later to a developer out of Springfield, pocketed $18,000, and moved to Nevada where he went into a cattle trucking business that folded in 1970. Earl took the South 80, the creek, the old equipment, and a small equipment shed that leaked when it rained. His wife Linda looked at that shed, looked at the rusted disc, the oil-burning Model A, and the baler that had to be coaxed like a mule, and she cried. Not in front of Earl, but he heard her that night in the kitchen, talking to her sister on the phone. He took the junk, Carol. He took the worst of it, and he thinks he can make it work. Earl did think he could make it work. But thinking and doing were different animals. That first year, 1968, he planted 40 acres of soybeans and 30 of corn, left 10 for pasture and the creek bottom. The Model A burned oil, so he learned to mix his own blend. Heavier weight, ran it thick. The baler jammed. So he rebuilt the knotter mechanism using parts from a machine shop in Carthage and a diagram he found in a 1951 operator's manual he bought at an estate sale. The disc was rusted, so he spent a week with a wire brush, sandpaper, and rust converter, then another week greasing every bearing and zerk fitting until the thing would turn again. People in town called him Junkyard Earl. The man at the co-op in Carthage asked him once, in front of 4 other farmers, why he didn't just buy something that worked. Earl said, "Because what I got already works. You just got to know how." Clayton, meanwhile, was the pride of the county. New tractor, new planter, new everything. He ran a clean operation, had field days where other farmers would come look at his setup, and he talked a lot about yield efficiency and cost margins. By 1970, he was farming his 120 and leasing another 60 from a widow over near a villa. People respected Clayton. He was modern, forward-thinking, the kind of farm extension agents used in their pamphlets. But there was something else, something people didn't talk about much. Clayton was leveraged to his eyeballs. That new tractor, the planter, the sprayer rig, the grain truck, he didn't own any of it outright. The bank in Carthage owned it, and Clayton made payments. As long as the yields were good and the prices held, he was fine. But farming's got a way of not staying fine. Earl, on the other hand, owned everything he had. It was old, it was ugly, and it broke down, but when it broke, he fixed it. He didn't owe a payment to anyone. His 80 acres weren't much, but they were as free and clear, same as equipment. By 1972, he'd paid off the small loan he'd taken to buy seed that first year, and after that, everything he made went back into ground or into the house. Linda stopped crying. Their daughters grew up riding in the Model A, sitting on fenders, learning to grease zerks before they learned to write cursive. People still called him Junkyard Earl, but it didn't sting the same way. He'd made it work. Then 1974 hit, and the bottom fell out. It wasn't just one thing, it was everything. Fuel prices shot up after the oil embargo. Fertilizer costs doubled, and the markets went sideways. Farmers who'd been running tight margins found themselves underwater. Drought hit the region that summer, the worst in a decade, and by August, the ground was cracking. Earl's Creek slowed to a trickle, but it didn't stop. Clayton's wells, dug shallow in the North Field, started pulling mud. He had to truck water in, expensive, and his yields dropped 40%. The bank started calling. By September, Clayton was behind on his equipment payments, and by November, the bank sent a man out to talk repossession. Earl heard about it from a guy at the feed store. He drove over to Clayton's place on a Saturday morning, found his brother sitting on the porch, staring at the new tractor that wasn't new anymore, that was about to belong to someone else. Earl sat down next to him, didn't say anything for a while. Finally, Clayton spoke. "You were right." Earl shook his head. "Wasn't about being right, Clay. Was about what I could live with." Clayton looked at him, eyes red. "I'm going to lose it, Earl." All of it. The land, the equipment, maybe the house. Earl was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You could sell some of the ground, pay down the debt, keep the rest." Clayton laughed bitter. To who? Who's buying in this market? Earl didn't have an answer for that. He went home, told Linda, and she put her hand on his arm. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Earl nodded. "He's my brother. Here's where I want to know what you do. Your brother made his choice, took the modern road, the debt, the risk, and now it's all falling apart. Do you help him, knowing he thought you were a fool? Or do you let him learn the lesson the hard way?" Comment below, because what Earl did next is something not every man could do. Earl went to the bank in Carthage the following Monday and met with a loan officer named Raymond Purcell, a man with a thin mustache and a manner that suggested he'd foreclosed on better men than you. Earl asked what Clayton owed. Raymond looked at him over his glasses. "That's between the bank and your brother, Mr. Garrison." Earl leaned forward. "I know what he owes in principle. I'm asking what it'd take to clear him." Raymond was quiet for a moment, then pulled a file. $22,000. That's equipment, operating loan, and the land note he took to lease the Avila parcel. Earl felt his stomach drop. He didn't have $22,000. He had his land, his equipment, and about $4,000 in savings. He left the bank, drove home, didn't say a word to Linda until after dinner. When he finally told her, she sat down hard. "Earl, we can't. We just can't." He nodded. "I know." But he kept thinking about it. Kept thinking about his father's words in the will, about not splitting what was meant to work as one. The land was already split, but maybe the family didn't have to be. He came up with a plan, a bad one, but the only one he had. He'd offer the bank his 80 acres as collateral against Clayton's debt, work out a payment plan, and he and Clayton would farm both parcels together, pooling equipment, splitting costs and profits. It was risky as hell. If they failed, Earl would lose everything too. Linda looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You'd risk our home, our land, for him?" Earl said, "He's my brother, and Dad would have done it." He went back to the bank, made the offer. Raymond Purcell listened, made some notes, said he'd talk to the board. A week later, they agreed, but with conditions. Earl's 80 acres would secure a consolidated loan. Clayton would have to sell the new tractor and most of the new equipment to pay down part of the debt, and both brothers would be jointly liable for the remaining balance. If one failed, both lost everything. Earl signed. Clayton, when Earl told him, broke down. Not loud, not dramatic, just sat in his kitchen and put his head in his hands. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do this?" Earl said, "Because you're my brother, and because I remember what Dad said. We split it all, but we don't have to break it." They sold Clayton's International, his new planter, his sprayer, bought a used Alice Chalmers, a good one, older but solid, and consolidated equipment. They started farming both parcels together, a combined 200 acres, using Earl's old Model A, the Farmel, the rebuilt baler, the patched-together disc. It was ugly, it was slow, but it worked. They worked dawn to dark, and Linda helped, and Clayton's girlfriend, a woman named Ruth from Jasper, came out on weekends. By the end of 1975, they'd made the first payment. By the end of 1976, they'd made 3 more. The drought broke in the spring of 77. The rains came, and that year they had the best yield either of them had ever seen. People in town started talking about the Garrison brothers, the ones who'd figured it out. Not Clayton with his shiny equipment, not Earl with his junk, but both of them together, making it work with old iron and sweat. The bank man, Raymond Purcell, saw Earl at the co-op one day in 1978 and nodded. "You boys are ahead of schedule," he said. Earl nodded back. "We had a good year." Raymond smiled thin. "It's more than that. You did what most men won't. You set your pride down. Now, before we get to the end of this, I need you to do something for me. If this story is hitting you in the chest, if you're thinking about your own family, your own brothers, your own choices, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories like this, real farm life, real decisions, the kind of thing that doesn't make the news but makes the difference. Subscribe, and let's keep these stories alive. By 1980, Earl and Clayton had paid off the consolidated loan. The land was theirs again, free and clear, and they kept farming it together. They bought a newer tractor, a 1974 John Deere 4230, paid cash, and they kept the old Model A running, partly because it still worked and partly because it had been their father's. Clayton married Ruth, built a small house on the north parcel, and they had 2 kids. Earl's daughters grew up. One became a teacher, the other went to AG school in Columbia. The farm was still split on paper, 2 parcels, 2 owners, but in practice, it was 1 operation, 1 family, and it worked. Tom, the middle brother, came back to Missouri in 1982. His cattle trucking business had failed, his marriage had failed, and he was broke. He showed up at Earl's door on a Tuesday evening. Thinner than Earl remembered, older in the eyes. "I heard you and Clay made it work," he said. Earl invited him in, gave him coffee, listened. Tom asked if there was any room for him, any way to buy back in. Earl and Clayton talked about it, talked to their wives, and in the end, they offered Tom a job, wages, not ownership, but a place to work and a place to stay. Tom took it. He worked the farm for the next 6 years, saved his money, and eventually bought a small parcel adjacent to the South Creek, started his own small operation. He never got back what he'd sold, but he got something. The Model A finally died in 1985, threw a rod, cracked the block, and even Earl couldn't bring it back. They buried it, in a way, parked it under a tree on the south pasture, and let the kids climb on it. But the lessons it had taught, the years it had given them, those didn't die. Earl kept the other equipment running. And when something finally wore out past fixing, he replaced it with something used, something solid, and he taught his grandsons to do the same. Now here's the question I'll leave you with. When Earl sat in that bank in 1974 and put everything he had on the line for his brother, do you think he did the right thing? Or was he a fool risking his family's future for someone else's mistakes? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments, because this is the kind of choice that defines a man, and I think a lot of you have been there one way or another. The rain had stopped 3 hours before dawn, but the mud along the county road south of Mineral Wells still grabbed at truck tires like it had something to prove. Earl Garrison sat in his '68 Ford. No, wait, it was a 1979 Chevy now. The Ford had rusted out in '76. Windows down, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, staring at the fence line that used to mark where his father's land began. Only now, 11 years after the split, it marked where his and Clayton's land worked together. The sun came up over the east pasture, same as it always had, and Earl thought about his father's words. Don't split what's meant to work as one. They'd split the land, but they hadn't split the family, and that, Earl figured, was what the old man had meant all along. He started the truck, pulled onto the road, and headed back to the house. There was work to do. There was always work to do, but it was good work, honest work, and it was his. The old gear had kept them going when the new gear failed, and the old ways had kept them together when the new ways tried to pull them apart. 3 brothers had split the farm, but only the one who kept his father's old gear, who understood that value isn't in shine, but in what holds together under pressure, still owned his land and still had his family. And in the end, that was worth more than all the new tractors in the county. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to this story. These tales of farm life, of hard choices and harder men, of land and legacy, and the things we pass down, they matter. They're part of who we are, part of the backbone of this country, and they're disappearing fast. So do me a favor, share this video with someone who'd understand. Comment your own story, your own family's farm, your own split or your own salvation. And subscribe, because we're going to keep telling these stories as long as people want to hear them. The old ways, the old iron, the old values, they still mean something and they always will.